Okay. The translators asked me if I had my notes to help them, if you want. Sorry about that. Some of us belong to a different epoch, just like the social democracy. I'm attempting to adapt to the new epoch, but they are definitely finished. Well, it's my task to give a very long period of history and outline what the social democracy was, what it became, and why it has ended the way it is. Now, social democracy has become synonymous with betrayal, and its leaders are hardly distinguishable from bourgeois liberal politicians. In economics, they accept the market economy, the profit motive, and all that flows from that. When in government, they carry out the needs of the capitalist class, and in so doing, they have given a dirty name to the very idea of the left, among wide layers even of the working class. Sometimes when I'm talking to this kind of working class person, I actually say, don't confuse me with the left. In Italy in particular, la sinistra. La sinistra makes you sick. Because the workers cannot see the difference. In fact, they see them very often as part of the enemy. As a consequence of all this, in some countries, the old socialist parties have either completely disappeared or have been reduced to minor forces. You probably don't even know there was such a thing as the Italian Socialist Party, il PSI, TSI, whose symbol until the 1970s included the hammer and sickle. That was a consequence of the history when they adhered to the Third International. In 1945, the Socialist Party actually got more votes than the Italian Communist Party. But they were so embroiled in government and corruption over decades that they literally did collapse completely and disappear. That doesn't mean that reformism disappeared from the map, because the old communist parties became reformist over decades. It's not about that here, but the Italian Communist Party evolved into the Democratic Party and basically disappeared as a force as well. In Greece, the PASOK, there was a time when in the 80s, the PASOK was getting over 48% of the vote. In January 2015, it hit rock bottom at less than 5%. Since then, it's recovered a little bit, but it's never gone back to its glory days. In France, the Socialist Party, in 1981, François Mitterrand, in the second round of the presidential elections, won nearly 52%. 2017, it collapsed to an unprecedented low of 6.3%. The German Social Democrats used to be a strong political force, over 40% of the vote in certain periods. In the latest polls, is standing at 12%. And the British Labour Party, which in 1966 got 48%, is now at half of that, and in real terms, probably a lot less. Now, I could list country after country after country with the same process taking place. This is how social democracy has ended. Now, I would outline four more or less four periods. 1875 to 1913, the classic epoch when social democracy at least formally declared itself Marxist. The First World War is a turning point where they betray the working class everywhere. Then we have the period from 1914 to 1933. Then we have the post-war boom period, 1945 to the 1970s, and what has happened since the 70s. Now, the Second International was formed formally in 1889 in a conference in Paris. It was the rebuilding of the international, the first international which had been dissolved. It was built as a mass force in some countries and declared, at least formally, that it was Marxist. Now, I'm going to spend a lot of time on the German social democracy because it was considered the flagship of the International. It was the biggest force, the leading force, the force that everybody else looked to. I will mention what happened in 1875 in a moment, but in 1878, shortly after being set up, Bismarck passed the famous anti-socialist laws, and those laws were in place until 1890, and activists of the social democracy were persecuted. 1,500 party activists were sentenced to a total of 1,000 years in prison. This made them immensely popular amongst the masses. And we see, once the laws have lifted, the party emerges much stronger. In 1890, they got 1.5 million votes and 35 seats in the Reichstag. And I'll quote here, the SPD's combination of Marxist revolutionary rhetoric and practical law-abiding political activity created a model that was widely admired and emulated by emerging socialist parties across Europe. In Austria, and Belgium, and Switzerland, and many other countries. In France, we had the original Parti Ouvrier Français of Guesde in 1879 declaring itself a Marxist party. And similar conferences took place across Europe with the founding of the various sections of the Second International. Now, I've read an interesting text. It's called The Tragedy of Social Democracy. And it's written as if it were a true tragedy. What a pity it went the way it did. The conclusions are that it should go back to being at least a reformist party, which tells you how far they've gone. But it's interesting, in the concluding part, and I want to quote some of it, the historical trajectory of social democracy has been a political tragedy. Social democracy has gradually moved from a revolutionary declaration of intent to throw the bourgeoisie into the dustbin of history to a spirit-degrading genuflection before the organized forces of capitalism. He points out to the stark contrast to revolutionary communism, and then outlines the reformist nature, saying that the democratic transformation of capitalism was predicated on the assumption that cumulative and irreversible social reforms would imperceptibly transform the capitalist social order into socialism. That's what it became in the classical period of social democracy, a party that still adhered to the goal of socialism, to parties that have abandoned that completely, even as the perspective. Today's social democrats do not go around saying, we're carrying out reforms as a gradual step towards socialism. You won't hear the leaders of the French Socialist Party today saying anything like that, or the great Burnham, who has now replaced Starmer. And yet, the term social democracy at one time actually symbolized revolutionary Marxism. You read the texts of Lenin, and you have to explain sometimes to younger comrades that when Lenin is referring to the Social Democrats, he's referring to the revolutionary Marxists. It's not by chance. The Russian party was called the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Well, so how did a formation like this, which was, even Lenin considered himself a social democrat, how did it end up as basically a bourgeois liberal formation? Well, Marx and Engels developed the ideas, the theory. Read the Communist Manifesto. After you've read a few other texts, read Capital, read Engels on the family, and so on. Marx and Engels, on the basis of these ideas, built the first and then the second international. Now, Marx and Engels, however, were in exile in Britain, and it was their followers on the ground in Germany that built the party. Men like Liebknecht, Wilhelm Liebknecht, Bebel. Now, I remember as a young comrade being given a brief explanation that the degeneration of the social democracy took place in a period that was similar to the post-Second World War period. You know, the objective factors, the boom. I remember one comrade telling me that Bebel was lucky that he died in 1913 because he didn't have to take part in the vote on the First World War. But looking back now, I think that was a rather superficial explanation because the roots of the degeneration of social democracy go much further back than the post-1890 economic expansion. Bebel and his comrades were in effect party men, the practicos, the party builders. They were in no way theoreticians. And the lack of theoreticians and the lack of theory will prove to be the undoing of German social democracy. Now, in 1875, there was the Gotha Congress that produced the Gotha program, which you've all heard Marx writing his critique of the Gotha program. Now, this was a Congress which fused two political currents in the German labor movement. The followers of Marx, who were known as the Eisenachers because of a previous Congress in Eisenach, and the forces that followed Lassalle. Now, the Lassallians were fundamentally a reformist current. One key aspect was a completely non-revolutionary understanding of the state. Now, Marx and Engels, when they heard that this fusion was about to take place, they came out very strongly against, and I will quote some of their letters. Don't want to quote this, don't need to quote this. Says. Yeah, there is before I moved to 1875, there is a famous letter, famous for us anyway, a letter by Engels to Bebel. It's on our website. And it was the question of what approach to have to the Lassallians. I'll quote some of his letter, just small parts. Listen to this, comrades, because I've had questions asked to me about how do we deal with people from other groups? Do we try and win them over? Listen to Engels. It is easy to pay too much attention to one's rival and to get into the habit of always thinking about him first. Our view, which we have found confirmed by long practice, is that the correct tactic in propaganda is not to draw away a few individuals and members here and there from one's opponent, but to work on the great mass which still remains apathetic. He says, the primitive force of a single individual whom we have ourselves attracted from the crude mass is worth more than 10 Lassallian renegades. Listen to this. Who always bring the seeds of their false tendencies into the party with them. We've been there several times, have we not, comrades? Maybe we should learn some lessons from Engels. And then he says, one must not allow oneself to be misled by the cry for unity. Unity is inverted commas here. Those who have this word most often on their lips are those who sow the most dissension. Did they take Engels' advice? No. Within 2 years, they were organizing the Gotha Congress, in which they fused with, not only did they try and win over a few, they fused with the Lassallians into one party. They put above everything else the fusing into a bigger party numerically. See, lack of theory, and the only attention they had was the party, the party, the party, build the party. Marx and Engels found out about the fusion, not from their so-called comrades in Germany. They did not inform them that they were proceeding along those lines. I can imagine why. Marx would have told them a few harsh words. In fact, when Marx discovered what they were doing, he wrote the famous critique of the Gotha program. And he fiercely condemned the ideological compromises in that program. In that critique, he tried to convince his comrades not to bend and not to give in on principles. Marx could see that the program made serious theoretical concessions to Lassalle. He threatened to dissociate himself publicly from that fusion. There are letters, Engels to Bebel in 1875. I'll quote. It's a letter to August Bebel. You ask me what we think of the unification affair. We are, unfortunately, in exactly the same boat as yourself. Neither Liebknecht nor anyone else has let us have any kind of information. And hence we too know only what is in the papers. Imagine. But I quote further. He talks about this program. Should it be adopted, Marx and I could never, and never is stressed, recognize a new party, and new is stressed, set up on that basis. And shall have to consider most seriously what attitude, public as well as private, we should adopt towards it. He goes on, as you yourself will realize, this program marks a turning point which may very well force us to renounce any kind of responsibility in regard to the party that adopts it. Anyway, I could go on and on. They were, to say the very least, very angry. Marx wrote another letter to W. Brack. He says, it is my duty, this is Marx, not to give recognition, even by diplomatic silence, to what in my opinion is a thoroughly objectionable program that demoralizes the party. Again, what they warn against is basically you're looking for a shortcut. You want to build a big party numerically, but you're compromising the principles to achieve it. I have here the Gotha program and lots of other texts, but I'll leave it to you to read. But you could say the origins of the future degeneration of the social democracy are found here in the early days. So it wasn't just the expansion of German capital and the boom that created the conditions for the degeneration. There was a theoretical basis to it. There was a weakness in theory. But then, after the lifting of the anti-socialist laws in 1890, we have the beginnings of a relatively long period of upswing, which is an important factor in strengthening the reformist tendencies. Now, in 1891, shortly after the lifting of those laws, there was the Congress of Erfurt, and there's the Erfurt program is adopted. Lenin considers it a good program. But just a little detail. Until 1891, Marx's critique of the Gotha program had never been published. Only a handful of the leaders had seen that critique. Engels was still alive. And it was because he insisted that it be published, that it was published. He felt the Marxist wing had made progress, now the party was in a better place, and he wanted to make sure that the principles were stuck to. Kautsky sent the draft to Engels. Engels made some corrections and suggestions, and it was published. But what's interesting is that Bebel, when he saw the text, he said, if I had been able to read it before, I would have stopped its publication and would have edited out parts. He was worried because it was too harsh on the Lassallians. Which shows you that the reformism of Lassalle was present even in the heads of these guys. Liebknecht was really taken aback. He did not want this published at all. He was probably the most opportunist of the lot. And it's in this context, and I'll go into it in a minute, that Bernstein appears with his texts. There was an open right wing inside the party already. The trade union leaders were on the right. Individuals like Volmar and others were carrying out the practical day-to-day work of fighting for reforms. The trade union movement was strengthening. Just to give you an example, the trade union membership in 1890 was 300,000. By 1905, it was over 1.3 million. And by 1913, over 2.5 million. A massive strengthening of the trade union movement. Now, the arguments of these revisionists, a la Bernstein, were that capitalism had resolved its inner contradictions. For instance, they took up the idea of the 10-year cycle of capitalism that Marx referred to, and saying there hadn't been a crisis for more than 10 years. Therefore, Marx was wrong, and we need to revise Marx. Rosa Luxemburg, in replying in her famous text, Reform or Revolution, pointed out that Marx never said the 10-year cycle was a law of capitalism. It was a description of facts, what had actually happened. But the inner contradictions of capitalism had not changed. The fact that a boom can last more than 10 years doesn't mean the inner contradictions have disappeared. They also looked at wages and conditions of the working class. Now, on the back of the boom, German capitalism was able to concede wage increases and reforms. But for example, in the period 1895 to 1907, that 12-year period, the average increase in production of a German worker was 95%, a 95% increase. Average wages, however, went up by little over 50%. That means that the exploitation of labor was actually increasing, even though in real absolute terms, workers were feeling a material benefit. But they also ignored another element. It wasn't the whole of the working class that was benefiting. The mass of wages between 1887 and 1914, more or less this period, increasing by 5.1%. But what Engels referred to as the aristocracy of labor saw wage increases of over 13%. So there was a layer of the working class which was benefiting more. All of this combined with a relative softening of class relations, the relative strengthening, it strengthened the idea that a gradual reform of the system was possible, and that it was possible to achieve socialism gradually through reforms and through Parliament. The first signs, really, in practice could be seen in 1912, when the Social Democrats actually formed an electoral alliance for the first time with a bourgeois party, the Progressive People's Party. Rosa Luxemburg was very critical of that. But at the same time as all this was happening, we see the growth and the strengthening of a party bureaucracy. There was a report published in 1914 on the number of paid party functionaries. There was over 4,000 of these functionaries. There's a text by Zinoviev that describes this. He says in reality, they are no longer workers. They have an income which is greater than that of a middle bourgeois. And they have long given up their occupation as workers. And a lot of these functionaries came precisely from that layer that Engels and later Lenin took it up, considered as the aristocracy of labor. And it became basically a self-sustaining bureaucracy concerned with organization and administration. And also there was a high percentage of skilled workers. Now, as I said, Engels had insisted on the publication of Gotha program in 1891, and there was, as I said, there was a reason for it. I can quote a text describes what happened. It says, the publication of these documents caused deep indignation in the party, especially because of the harsh words against Lassalle. And he describes the mood in the party. And it's an interesting little letter. In 1891, Bebel wrote a letter to Kautsky. This is the note on the letter. It says, Bebel did not accept the form of Marx's critique, believing that it would make a bad impression on the SPD and damage the opinion held of Marx there. He was of the opinion that Marx's harsh words on Lassalle would make Marx look bad in the party. He adds here, he did not entirely agree with the assessment of Lassalle that Marx makes. But listen to what he says to Kautsky. He says, we do not agree about Lassalle. That is the assessment of Lassalle. Because Kautsky was at least formally supporting Engels' position at this time. Listen to this. Bebel to Kautsky. You are a theoretician. And as such, you overestimate the theoreticians to the same extent that you underestimate the practical ones. What we have here is Bebel saying, you're a theoretician, I'm a practical party builder. How many times have we seen that distinction in the movement ever since these days? What was the difference between Trotsky and Stalin? Well, there were many, but there was one key element. Trotsky was a Marxist theoretician. Stalin was not. Stalin was the practical guy. Or in the Fourth International, people like James Cannon. He was a party man, party builder. No time for theory. We've had it ourselves in more recent years. There is this tendency to look down on theory and theoreticians on the part of the so-called practical party builders. Now, a person like Bebel, what was his role in the party? What he was concerned about was holding the party together and avoiding splits. The way they did this was to formally adhere to Marxism at party congresses, in the big speeches, but then in practice, they got on with their reformist politics. And they tried to hold together irreconcilable tendencies within the social democracy. And the problem for Bebel, when Bernstein came out with his ideas, was that he was worried this would create splits. He wrote to Kautsky and said, you must intervene against Bernstein. Because you see, Kautsky was considered the Red Pope, the great theoretician, which he later proved not to be up to the task at all. But at the time, he was seen as the authority of Marxism. So Bebel asked him, you must come out against Bernstein. Bernstein, what did he do? He wrote a letter to Dear Eddie, his friend Eddie Bernstein. He didn't say to him, you must renounce your theoretical errors. He basically appealed to him not to publish this stuff, not to go in writing. And Bernstein, at least he was honest, he replied, all I have done is put in writing what we've been doing in practice for years. What Bebel was worried about was that this could provoke what he considered the extreme left of the party. He was hoping that Kautsky, by coming out officially, could hold everything together as they had done. But Kautsky dithered, and in the meantime, Rosa Luxemburg produced her famous text. Now, in Bernstein's writings, you have all the thinking which would determine the behavior of the social democracy for decades to come. Rosa Luxemburg produced Reform or Revolution. She criticized Bernstein for abandoning scientific socialism, basically explained that you remove the scientific thinking of Marxism, that socialism is an objective necessity that flows from the crisis of capitalism. She says it then becomes anything you want to call it, but it is no longer the result of the material development of society. What we have here was in effect an anticipation of the future split in social democracy, which would take place after the First World War. But in a similar period in Russia, in 1903, you have the division between Bolsheviks and Mensheviks. It was in effect an international phenomenon, this division. It's interesting though, I found some texts that describe the situation of social democracy throughout this period as lacking in theoreticians. I have a text here, it's called The Red Pope, on Karl Kautsky. It says, before the 1880s, only a few of the leading figures of German social democracy could be described with considerable reservations as Marxists. He says, Their acceptance of Marx's economic theory was often accompanied by an endorsement of various non-Marxist theories. He says, Marx and Engels had many reservations about Liebknecht's theoretical views. There's a lot more I could quote, but I haven't got the time. I found an interesting comment by the Italian Marxist Labriola in this period. He actually says that unfortunate Marx did not have the honor of leaving behind him a school that could have continued him. And there's many other comments about the lack of theoreticians. And the best of them was Kautsky, which shows you what a bad state the social democracy was from a point of view of theory. Even on Kautsky, I found some letters by Engels. This is what Engels says about Kautsky in 1881. He is an extremely honest person, but he is an incorrigible pedant and scholastic. In his hands, complex questions do not become simple, but rather simple ones become complicated. And then he goes on to say, we're very fond of him, you know. But he says, I'll read the whole quote. I myself and all of us are very fond of him, and on the other hand, in longer articles in magazines, he may sometimes contribute valuable things. But with the best of will, he will not be able to change his nature. Such a doctrinaire in a newspaper is a real disgrace. That's Engels. Listen to what Marx has to say, again in 1881. He says, he is a mediocre, narrow-minded, know-it-all. In his own way, very zealous, he makes a great show of statistics, even though there is little sense in all this. He essentially belongs to the race of Philistines. He's being soft, Marx, But then he has, but otherwise, he is a decent person in his own way. Now, Kautsky did play a role in helping to publish the texts and all the rest of it, and he did have a certain understanding of Marxism. But as you can see, he had his limits. And his limits were shown when he needed to apply the theory to practice. Now, I wanted to say something about the leaders of the social democracy. Quite a lot of them were workers. Some came from the trade unions. As I said, a lot came from the labor aristocracy. Now, these guys, their concern became one of winning elections, paying a lot of attention to administrative detail, while ignoring the political principles. In the meantime, the party had developed into a mass organization. In 1913, they had over 1 million members, nearly 3 times what they had in 1906. I found an interesting study that showed, however, in this period, the social composition of the party was changing. The middle class elements in 1903 were 16%. By 1912, they were 34%. But it's not just a question of the middle classes. It's also the type of workers they had, which I'll go to into a minute. I found here a text, interesting study of the history of the social democracy. It says, the extent to which considerations of electoral success were influencing the political decisions made by the SPD leadership is illustrated by the behavior of the German delegation at the Socialist International in Stuttgart in 1907. The German representatives, led by August Bebel, voted against a resolution which reaffirmed in principle the International's complete rejection of colonialism. See, they felt they couldn't stand in the elections in Germany, with Germany then had several colonies. You can see how and where they were going. There's a lot of stuff here I have to jump. Yeah, the type of leaders, the proletarian leaders. How many times have you seen this idea that if you're a worker, then you remain solid and on a principled stand? So You know, a working class base is a guarantee of maintaining a principled position. No, comrades. What maintains a principled position is an educated cadre base in Marxism and the principles of Marxism. Look at people like Gustav Nosk, who became the Minister of Defense in 1919. You know what his job was when he was still working? He was a basket maker, a worker. In 1918, he used the Freikorps militias to repress the uprisings. Rosa Luxemburg was one of the victims of the Freikorps. Friedrich Ebert, he was the first SPD president of Germany. What did he do? He was a saddle maker. Philipp Scheidemann, Reich Minister, President in 1919. He was a typesetter and letterpress printer. You see, they were all workers. We should avoid this idea that if you have workers, then the party, let's say that the revolutionary principles can be adhered to, and if you have petty bourgeois, then it's the opposite. It was Rosa Luxemburg, I don't think she was ever a skilled worker, but she adhered to Marxism, while these so-called workers at the top of the social democracy betrayed the working class. So I think from this period, few lessons can be learnt. Don't look for shortcuts in building the party. Don't look to winning forces with which you don't have a principled agreement with. Don't give in on theoretical principles. Because as a shortcut, you might win over large numbers to the party. But in the process, you transform the party from a revolutionary party into the reformist organizations which they became. Another thing is workerism. Workerism often is accompanied with opportunism. And here we had all these workers' leaders who were at the core of the practical politics that Bebel referred to. So you can see the degeneration of the social democracy was there at the beginning, at the theoretical level, and then this was strengthened by the upswing in the economy that created the material conditions which facilitated the spread of reformist ideas. Now, the separation between formal declarations and practice is eventually seen in 1914. In 1907, at the International of the Conference of the Second International, I quote, "If a war threatens to break out, it is the duty of the working classes and their parliamentary representatives to exert every effort in order to prevent the outbreak of war by the means they consider most effective." And they said that the war should be used to hasten the downfall of capitalist rule. This was repeated in 1912 at the conference. And then in 1914, we saw what they did. They acted logically, according to their reformist outlook, and they voted for the war credits and betrayed the working class. What I described in Germany was taking place in many other countries. In France, you had a similar process. The party formally was formed as a Marxist party, but then we have the famous Millerand affair in 1899, where Millerand, a French socialist, joined the coalition government with bourgeois to defend the Republic against the threat of sort of proto-fascist elements. Lenin was very harsh on Millerand. He considered it, opportunist practice of class collaboration and a betrayal of working class interests. I could quote Lenin at length, but Rosa Luxemburg actually wrote a lengthy piece called "The Socialist Crisis in France," where she's very hard on the French socialist leaders. She says, "With the entry of Millerand into the radical cabinet, the socialists stood entirely upon the same grounds as their bourgeois allies." And she explains how the party should have behaved, that the essential aim of everything the party does is the education of the working class. And in Britain, It's not quite the same phenomenon in the sense that the Labour Party, from day one, didn't have an official adherence to Marxism. In that sense, there was no need to justify your actions by trying to wiggle your way out of previous statements. The party was formed out of the trade unions, and the trade union leaders were among the most conservative layers. By the way, in the German social democracy, the trade union officials always stood on the right. They welcomed Bernstein's position. I read a book called Parliamentary Socialism by Ralph Miliband, the father of the Milibands, who had a reputation as being a kind of Marxist in the post-war period. But he writes an interesting text. He actually says the Labour Party has always been one of the most dogmatic, not about socialism, but about the parliamentary system, i.e. parliamentary politics. And he quotes Ramsay MacDonald from 1909, who says, socialism, you see, they were still talking about achieving socialism. He says, socialism is to come through a socialistic political party and not through a socialist one. It says everything about what you have to say about these leaders. Their whole politics was dominated about parliamentary representation of the labour movement. At the same time, the bourgeois, the more intelligent bourgeois, were also considering they needed a political force to be able to manage the labour movement. So the Labour Party eventually became that instrument. What's interesting, however, is this. The Labour Party did not recognise the class struggle. It did not even declare itself to be a socialist party. But just as I explained the objective factors that led to the shift to reformism in the German social democracy, in Britain we have an element of the opposite. The party starts off as an openly, in effect, social democratic, in the modern meaning of that word. Lenin, in 1908, actually defended the affiliation of the Labour Party to the Second International. I don't remember the exact quote, but it was like, the Labour Party doesn't recognise the class struggle today, but the class struggle will recognise the Labour Party tomorrow. And in fact, in 1918, on the back of the radicalisation taking place in Britain also, which I haven't got time to go into, some amazing class struggles appeared in this period. This led to 1918, when they adopted Clause 4, Part 4, where they eventually actually, in effect, declared themselves a socialist party. Now, I just want to make a note here. The crisis of the system and the First World War created the conditions which eventually led to the initial 1903 split, the divisions in the German social democracy around Bernstein, becoming not internal divisions, but open splits into two political formations. Now, in 1914, the social democracy betrayed the working class. From 1917 until the mid-20s, we saw a process of differentiation and splits within the social democracy and the emergence of mass communist parties. But Lenin understood that in spite of the previous betrayals, the leaders of the social democracy still had the loyalty of a big section of the working class. That's why Lenin insisted on educating the leaders of the Third International on the need to adopt the United Front tactic. It became a central plank of international communist policy. Now, Lenin insisted on this because this was the way to reach the ranks of the social democracy, a way of winning them on the basis of experience and joint action. A reading of left-wing communism, Infantile Disorder, is an important part of the education of all our comrades on this question. Now, on the back of a correct application of the United Front, where it was applied, because unfortunately in Italy, for instance, it was not applied by the Italian Communist Party in the early days. But to give you an example, in 1920, the KPD got 500,000 votes and about 2%. By 1924, they had 3.5 million votes and 12.6%. They were winning layers of the working class. And the social democracy had a problem. The right wing wishing to carry out the interests of capital and class compromise, the more it did that, the more it lost support to its left, to the German communists. And this was a similar scenario in other countries. Even in Britain, where it was a small force, when they correctly applied that policy, the influence and the strength of the communists was growing. Had the communist parties continued with the correct application of the United Front systematically throughout the 1920s, today probably we would not be talking about social democracy anymore. It would have been destroyed as a phenomenon. The masses would have been won over to revolutionary communism. Unfortunately, it's in this period, in the late 20s, that the Communist International adopts the theory of the third period. Now, if comrades haven't read it, I suggest a text by Trotsky. It's called The Third Period of Comintern Errors, in which he's trying to explain to the ranks of the communist parties who were convinced we are the revolutionary party, either with us or against us. The Social Democrats are social fascists. They are tools of the capitalist class. Twins, in fact, with fascism. Now, this created a barrier between the ranks of the communist parties and the ranks of the social democracy. It blocked the process. But interestingly, on the basis of the pressure of events, of the objective situation, we have the shifting to the left within the social democracy. I can't find it now. Trotsky quote. I might find it later, I don't know. Trotsky's analyzing the phenomenon of centrism. And he says basically, inside the social democracy, in countries like France, for instance, the leadership has shifted from open reformism to what we define as centrism. Centrism, in Marxist terms, means vacillating between revolutionary Marxism and reformism. It's the center between those two phenomena. It's not the center of bourgeois politics, centrist parties. And Trotsky said that the building of the forces of the Fourth International will be determined by a correct application of the tactic of the United Front. Here we had a mass radicalization of the ranks of the social democracy, but the communist parties had cut off the road to reach that layer, which could have been won over to a revolutionary communist position. So, I have a lot of figures here, I don't have time to give on the relative sizes of these parties. But the fact remained that the social democracy in most countries remained the main party of the working class in terms of votes and numbers and members and force. Well, here it is. Of the many articles that Trotsky wrote, 2 articles on centrism, February 1934. He says, the majority of reformists now deliberately employ new colors. Reformism gives place to the innumerable shades of centrism. Unfortunately, the Trotskyists were a small force. But what this did was to give the leaders of the social democracy renewed authority in the eyes of the masses. Some of their speeches sounded like revolutionary talk. And because of that, they were able to betray the working class yet again. In Germany, in the build-up to the rise of Hitler, and then when they flipped the other way, when they abandoned the third period, it wasn't to go back to Lenin's United Front. They flipped to open collaboration with the bourgeois, and the theory of popular frontism then became the policy. And then they combined in the betrayal of the working class in this class collaborations policy. So a historic opportunity was lost in the 1920s because of these errors to win over the mass of the German working class, the French, the Spanish. Can you imagine mass revolutionary communist parties leading the class struggle in these countries in that period? It would have meant the spreading of the socialist revolution across the whole of Europe. That, of course, didn't happen because of the reasons I outlined. Then we have the Second World War. In some countries like Germany and Italy, of course, the socialists and communists were illegal, but they re-emerged as mass forces at the end of the Second World War. Just to give you an example, in Italy, the Communist Party had close to 2 million members in 1945. But not many people realized that the Socialist Party had 800,000 members. That was the revival of the socialist tradition in Italy. But the reformism of the social democracy and the popular frontist degeneration of the Communist International meant that the two forces were used to stabilize capitalism at the end of the Second World War. Social democracy entered coalitions with bourgeois governments, good bourgeois parties. They were expelled in 1947 after having been used. Just to give a taste of France, 1945, the Socialist Party, the SFIO, they got 4.5 million votes, 24%. The Communist Party, 5 million votes, 26%. See how powerful the workers' organizations were. They could have taken power in this period, but they did not. They sold the idea to the masses that the revolution was a democratic revolution. And the bourgeoisie said, thank you very much. After having used them and no longer had need for them, they kicked them out of government. But the post-war period is the beginning of the most powerful boom that capitalism has ever lived through. With the help of the leaders, they were able to stabilize the system, and the bourgeois were forced to make concessions. In Italy, in December 1945, with the very high inflation, they conceded the sliding scale of wages to the Italian working class. In France, votes for women, nationalizations of energy, of transport, Renault. Possibly the clearest example is the British Labour government of 1945 to 51. To the masses, it seemed that the Labour Party now, for the first time in its history, was actually carrying out reforms. The National Health Service. You can't imagine what that means to an ordinary working class family. A free doctor, a hospital when you get ill. And on top of that, nationalizations of many sectors. The coal, steel, power, etc. They actually brought about 20% of the British economy under state control. They even introduced elements of planning in these sectors. A massive housing program, huge amount of social housing, cheap social housing for working class families. Free education, up to and including the university level. This was probably the period where the ideas of reformism seemed to be not just a theory, but they were real. Workers are very practical. The Labour Party has given us the NHS. They've carried out all these reforms. And life is getting better. Wages, real wages, were going up. A similar process, however, to what I said about Germany. Productivity was always going up higher than wages. But up until the 1970s, there was a real material improvement in the living standards of workers, at least in the more advanced capitalist countries. In Western Europe, in North America, and to a degree in other parts of the world. Now, I've been told, I'm tempted to do it, to quote an Italian socialist, to give you an idea of how the illusions had developed by the early 60s. This is Lombardi. I wrote an article about him, comparing him to a chameleon. This is what he said about capitalism in 1963. It has the ability to provide an answer to the elementary problems, and also to the problems that go beyond the elementary ones of the working people. Listen to this. Today, neo-capitalism is capable of giving an answer to the problem of employment. It is able to ensure a minimum level of income, a certain type of capital accumulation, expansion of the economy, and distribution of income. This was based on the post-war boom. But it shows you complete lack of Marxist understanding. In the same period, Ted Grant was writing a document called Will There Be a Slump in 1960, at the peak of the boom. Now, why did he pose it as a question? Because in the labor movement at the time, nobody believed that a slump was going to take place. In that sense, it was a repetition of the thinking of Bernstein. Capitalism has gone through a long period of expansion. There was relative class peace, democracy. The idea of a gradual improvement and no need for class struggle dominated the labor movement. And it dominated the leadership and even the ranks of the social democracy. The German social democracy in the post-war period was eventually involved in many coalitions and governments. In 1959 in Germany, they felt so confident that at the Bad Godesberg Congress, in the new program they adopted, they eliminated what remained of Marxism in their policies, and they renounced Marxism completely. This was what was happening at the peak of the boom. But then again, just as the theories of Bernstein were rudely interrupted by the First World War, history has this annoying way of negating the reformists. That period, you could say, the turning point of the end of that post-war boom and all its reformist illusions came in the 1970s. It came with the real first serious downturn of the capitalist economy since the Second World War. In that period, the leaders of the social democracy adhered to what they considered their economic policy, which was Keynesianism. And the theory seemed to be working because capitalism was expanding, wages were going up, the market was growing, everything seemed to be fine. But if we look at it from a historical point of view, that 25, 30-year period of boom was actually a very short period of history. If I said to you, what happened between 1210 and 1250? Would you consider that a long period of history? You would see it as a moment in history. That's because it was a long time ago and they're all dead. But if I said to you in 1975, what has happened in the last 30 years? That seems an awful long time. And especially if you're living it and you're living the material benefits of that period. Nonetheless, Marxists must have the long view of history. And this is one of the greatest things that Ted bequeathed us with, was to rise above the immediate situation. And not to abandon the long view. And not to abandon an understanding of the fundamentals and the fundamental contradictions of the system. If you do that, you can prepare for the future events. Those future events which seem absurd to a lot of people. But when those events come and hit the same millions who thought it was absurd before, suddenly realize we need an alternative to all this. And in the 1970s, that began. And anticipation was May 68 in France. 1972 in Britain, they were on the verge of a general strike. I lived it as a young boy. I've said it before, my dad was on strike for 7 weeks that year. I used to come home from school, put my satchel down, and listen to my dad's strike report. How the assembly had gone, how the strike was going. Millions of young people lived through that experience. In Italy, you had the big struggles of Fiat in 1980. And then in Britain, again, the miners' strike of 84-85. We had an anticipation of the future in the 70s. We saw in some of the social democratic parties the emerging of left wings. Tony Benn in the Labour Party. In Italy, Lombardi, 10 years later, was quoting Lenin and Trotsky and the crisis of the system. In PASOK, the PASOK, which emerged as a party in that period, was a centrist formation. It was a reflection of the intense class struggle. But the leadership of the labor movement, in particular the leadership this time of the social democracy and the communist parties, particularly in countries like Italy and France, and later Spain, they played a role at the crucial moment of selling the idea of national unity, compromise, sacrifices. We need to make sacrifices to get the economy back on its feet. And they prepared the defeats in many elections. The British Labour Party, after the victory of 74, was defeated in 79. Same thing in Italy in 79 with the defeat of the Communist Party. And opened up a new period. A period of mild reaction, we could say. The political pendulum swung back to the centre and towards the right. There was a demoralised mood in the ranks of the mass organisations. Everywhere you look, you see a moment which was a turning point. Italy, you could say, was 1977. Britain, 79, 80. All these countries had a moment in the late 70s and 80s which marked an end of that class conflict and rising tensions. And with it came an emptying out of the mass organizations and also of the trade unions. And the bourgeois went on the offensive. In this context, the leaders of social democracy were in effect freed from the pressure of the ranks, freed from the pressure of the left, and began to theorize anew. Tony Blair came out with his ideas of the third way together with, was it Schroeder, I think? And it was a further shift away from socialism. They formally adopted the idea. Their aim now was no longer socialism. It was no longer a gradual reformist approach to the eventual aim of socialism. These people have completely abandoned that. There is no talk of socialism. So in effect, the revisionism has gone one step further and has prepared the recent period. They have abandoned Keynesianism. They've adopted the bourgeois economic policies. When they come into government, they accept that they need to cut the public debt. They've accepted monetarism, basically. The problem is you have the 2008 crisis, which really sharply puts into focus the contradictions of the system. And in this context, we've had social democracy in Britain, for example, coming back to government. And in a few other countries, they've governed. But they've governed in a period of deep crisis of the system. They've actually directly been responsible for carrying out some of the worst anti-working class policies. For example, in Germany, Agenda 2010, which was introduced by the social democracy, which has labour market flexibility, increasing the age of retirement, and many other such measures. So now the social democracy is seen as having directly governed against the interests of the working class. In many countries, the increase in the age of retirement is connected to the social democracy. I have lots of articles here. They're all about, I'll give you the headlines. Populism and the decline of social democracy. The decay of social democracy. The right shift and decline of social democracy. And so on and so on. Interesting articles. I don't have time to quote. But what it says fundamentally, all of these articles, is the more they adopted these policies, the more they shifted to the right, the more they lost in electoral terms. We have the example of Syriza governing in Greece. Now on this I wanted to say something. The decline, and in some cases the collapse of social democracy, does not mean that reformism has been eliminated. Syriza rose on the back of the collapse of the PASOK. But they've gone through the same process. Massive surge in the elections, and then they lost more than half what they'd gained after they'd been in government. In Germany, we have a similar process, the social democracy in steep decline, and Die Linke rising on the left. We have Mélenchon still a force in France. Now, all of these are, technically speaking, from a historical point of view, are not social democracy. But in terms of the content of their program and their policy, they have adopted a social democratic outlook, i.e. a reformist outlook. Now, from all this, I've only been able to touch on some parts of this historical process. There are plenty of lessons to learn. The nature of capitalist economy and the inevitability of its crisis. That was one of the polemics between Rosa Luxemburg and Bernstein. An understanding of the class consciousness that gradually emerges from such crises. I've outlined different moments in history where we've seen that. The political impact all this has. The role of reformism throughout history. The role of the trade union leaders. The most conservative layer in society. Their aim is always to hold the class struggle back. It's also a lesson in understanding the different layers of the working class. In the process of radicalization, we saw how, in the split in the social democracy, the communist parties emerged as minorities in most cases. Our task today is to win the most advanced layer of the working class. Because different layers of the class move at different speeds. They draw conclusions at different tempos. We have to win the most advanced. Transform that force into a party that is capable of having a dialogue with the mass of the working class. Understand the importance of theory. Theoretical errors throughout this lead-off. In the early days of the social democracy, the errors of the Communist International, the theory of the third period, etc. Errors in theory inevitably produce errors in practice. That's why we give such attention, such importance to theory. What was missing in the social democracy in the early days? Theory and cadre building. But it's not just about learning from all this, comrades. We need to apply it in practice. We need to engage with the working class. We need to engage with the movements of the youth, with the understanding a new period of history has opened up. It's not by chance that serious bourgeois are comparing today to the 1930s. And there are many elements of past class struggles which are appearing today. So history has come full circle. The system is in a deep crisis. We have to learn the lessons of these 150 years of history, learn from the mistakes of the reformists, and build parties that Lenin struggled to build when he was leading the Third International. Look at the interventions, the speeches he gave, the texts he wrote. He was trying to educate the leadership of the communist parties. We must take that as a lesson. Adopt his program, learn from his program. Learn from his tactical intelligence, and finally produce those parties which the working class needs. The parties that Marx and Engels attempted to build, that Lenin built on. We have another chance. History is presenting us with an opportunity. Let's build that organization so that we can finally close this chapter of history, with the working class finally coming to power, taking over the means of production and planning them in the interests of the mass of humanity. That's it.
Thank you very much, Fred. That was superb. Now, I have a very full list and not nearly enough time, so I think I'm going to squeeze in one contribution before we take a break. Can I please have Tom Trossier from the United States? And you'll have 15 minutes, including translation.
Well, thanks, Fred. The social democracy never was developed into a mass force in the United States. You have the development of the Socialist Party of America that began in the early 1900s that pretty much comes to an end in 1919. It was a big tent party, a so-called multi-tendency party. I can safely say there was not a single theoretician in that party. If anybody knows of a theoretician that was around, please let me know. I'd love to get a hold of their books. The leading member of the party was Eugene Victor Debs. He was a courageous fighter and a militant leader, but he was not a Marxist and not a theoretician. In actual fact, when there were disagreements in the party among the leadership, Eugene Debs would basically exempt himself from those debates and discussions and tell the other leaders to sort it out among themselves. The weaknesses of the Socialist Party included, for example, their lack of an understanding and a lack of a program on an analysis on how to fight racism and segregation in the United States. There was also all sorts of confusion on the question of reform versus revolution. And even back then, there was the question of identity politics, although it may not have been called identity politics. You actually had set up sections of the party based on foreign language. For example, the Russian speakers were in the Russian Federation of the Socialist Party. The Greeks were in the Greek Federation. And so on and so on. Now, because of the growth of the American working class and the problems of capitalism, in spite of the deficiencies that I mentioned, the party had some success. The party membership rose by over 50,000 from 1901 to 1910. Then by 1910, I think they had about 58,000, and that number doubled during the Debs presidential campaign in 1912, reaching a peak membership of 113,000, more than 113,000. There was, they had a newspaper called Appeal to Reason, and at one point that had 700,000 subscribers. But I should point out that paper was not owned by the party, it was owned by a wealthy individual socialist. From 1921 to 1923, they had a congressman, Meyer London from New York City. And in 1919 and in 1923, they had another congressman from Milwaukee named Victor Berger. By the way, Victor Berger was on the right of the party, and he was a friend of Kautsky's. He was originally from Germany. From 1912 to 1938, the party ran more candidates for seats in the U.S. House of Representatives than any other minor party. Its height being 358 candidates in 1912, in the 1912 elections. In the 1912 elections, Debs himself got 6% of the vote for president, and 16 socialist candidates in the House elections that year received over 20% of the popular vote. 5 of those received over 30% of the popular vote. In 1920, Eugene Debs was in jail for speaking out against American intervention in World War I. And even though he couldn't campaign for president, he still got over 900,000 votes. But the problem of the party was resolved in 1990. The problems inside the party were resolved by a political split. There was not less than 3 separate splits from the Socialist Party that developed into what formed as the new Communist Party in the United States. Pretty much after those splits, you could say social democracy more or less disappeared. It was never a mass force, but at least it was a force of some significance. But it lost that significance after that. In the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, the main force on the left was the Communist Party, which we're not discussing today. After the end of World War II with the post-war boom and the McCarthy period, of course, the Communist Party goes through a serious decline, and the left becomes very hard to see in the United States. But the situation is demanding a new radical analysis of what's going on in the United States. And in that vacuum came people like Bernie Sanders and DSA. And now we're seeing that the sections of the advanced sections of the working class, of the youth that are looking for a solution have been going towards DSA. In some ways you could say DSA is a reestablishment of social democracy, but frankly, on an even more unprincipled basis. Whereas the old Socialist Party of America was at least an independent party, the DSA is pretty much running its candidates completely in the Democratic Party, on the Democratic Party line. We've seen the success of candidates like AOC and Mamdani, who won the elections of mayor last year in New York. And right now, the DSA is riding that wave of anger against the Trump administration and against the Republicans who are in power now. As a result, we anticipate that the DSA will continue to grow over the next period. They may even elect their first governor in Wisconsin this November. But ultimately, they do not have a program and they haven't built a party that can lead the working class to power. Just like social democracy in the past, they're going to be handcuffed by the capitalist system. And when the Democratic Party gets back into power, they will not have the excuse of blaming Donald Trump for everything. This will create a serious decline and a serious crisis in the DSA. Hopefully the more far-thinking section will start to draw some conclusions. They will start to move away from the Democratic Party. They will break with the Democratic Party. And then we can see about how, if they have a chance to build into a real independent party of the left. But if they stay with the Democrats like they did under Biden, that'll be the death of this version of social democracy. The crisis of American capitalism is very real. The anger of the American working class is very real. Big battles are ahead. We've got to learn these lessons from history and use it to build our forces. And if we continue to do that, I think that we can make a mark in the next period. Thanks, Cummins.
Thank you very much, Tom. We are now going to take a 25-minute break. So please join us in 25 minutes, and we will resume the discussion with Adam Booth from Britain being the first speaker. See you soon. All right, we are back, and without any further ado, I'm going to bring in Adam Booth from the British section.
Thanks very much, Joe. As Fred discussed, Britain has a slightly different tradition and history when it comes to social democracy. It was founded at the beginning of the 20th century, not as a Marxist party, but as the political or parliamentary voice of the trade unions. But even then, it should be emphasized, the trade union leaders, they really had to be pushed, kicking and screaming, into establishing the Labour Party. They wanted to cling on to the coattails of the Liberals. As Fred said, though, the party did shift to the left under the basis of events. In particular, even before the First World War, there was a period known as the Great Unrest, a period of intense industrial militant struggles in Britain. And then obviously the First World War, the Russian Revolution, all of this, as Fred said, resulted in the party's famous Clause 4. But Lenin emphasized in left-wing communism that the Labour Party, from its birth, had always been a bit of a contradiction. It was a bourgeois workers' party, he called it, with a working-class trade union membership base, but with a leadership that was completely imbued with reformism, Christian values, and even was outright bourgeois in many cases. But the sectarians who were trying to form the early British Communist Party, they didn't understand this contradiction. And they stood aloof from the Labour Party, stood outside of it, even when Lenin was urging them to go in and try and win workers from within it. But this contradiction was also contained to a certain degree by the position of British imperialism, which was able to afford a certain amount of privileges to the working class, able to afford certain scraps, certain benefits, particularly to the top layer of the workers' movement, the aristocracy of labour that Fred talked about. But by the 1920s, the British imperialism was beginning to undergo a decline, and British capitalism could no longer afford these extra crumbs. And very quickly then, the crisis of British capitalism became the crisis of British reformism. But by this time, you also had a massive growth in the working class, which helped to push Labour into power for the first time in 1924. Only very briefly, but then back again in 1929. But on both of these occasions, these were governments of crisis from day one. And they were the Labour leaders ended up really managing the decline of British imperialism and the crisis of British capitalism in this interwar period. The Prime Minister, Labour Prime Minister Ramsay MacDonald, he proposed such savage cuts in 1931 to try and save British capitalism that it split his government. And this right-winger, Ramsay MacDonald, he ended up joining forces with the Tories and the Liberals to form the national government, vowing going to the king, vowing to defend the national interest, which obviously meant the interest of the bankers. But this episode pushed the remainder of the Labour Party, that which didn't go with MacDonald, further to the left. Now today, if you speak to a reformist in the Labour Party, they won't ever mention those examples, and nor will they point to the similar examples that Fred mentioned in the 1970s. The Wilson and Callaghan governments, which ruled again in a period of intense crisis for British capitalism. Very soon after coming to power, they were forced to go to the IMF to get a bailout, which obviously came with strings attached, having to carry out huge cuts and attacks on the working class. You ended up with the unions in opposition to the Labour Party, but without any real strategy or way forward. All it did was pave the way for Margaret Thatcher and her government. So yes, the reformists today, they'll never mention those examples. They'll always highlight the 1945 Attlee government instead. The one that Fred mentioned in the post-war period that was able to bring in social housing, the NHS, nationalisation of the coal and the steel. But even then, you'll never hear the reformists really honestly explain how these reforms were actually won. That is on the basis of a massive radicalisation of the working class coming back from World War II, but also the fact that you had Marshall Aid coming from the US, able to offer some extra reforms to try and avert revolution. And also the fact that even the state intervention you did have in the economy, the nationalizations, a lot of that was for the benefit of the capitalists, not for the workers. The capitalists who hadn't invested in industry desperately needed modernization, and the state had to step in to do that. And they also needed a healthy, educated working class in order to be productive and competitive. And of course, the other government that the reformists today, and more actually the liberals and the right-wingers will point to, is of course Tony Blair with his 3 successive victories after 1997. But again, they'll never mention the period that this was in. The fact you had a general upswing for capitalism in this period at the end of the 90s and the early 2000s, when again capitalism could afford a certain amount of reforms. And even then, in this period in Britain, there was a massive intensification of labour, a huge squeezing of the working class taking place. And a lot of the wealth that was being created was fictitious. It was paper. It was being made in the City of London and Canary Wharf with speculation and financial services. And all of that went up in smoke in 2008. And Britain was hit one of the hardest by the crisis then. And Labour was in power trying to manage capitalism, again, trying to save capitalism, bailing out the banks. Again, just got associated with saving capitalism and prepared the way for another 16 years of Tory rule. So again, Labour, as Fred said, they've come back into power 2 years ago. But we should emphasise it's not because they're popular. Starmer was not popular then, he's certainly not popular now. Rather, they came in because the Tories were so discredited and hated from also managing capitalism over those 16 years. But when Starmer came in, a lot of the establishment, they were really hoping Starmer would be a replica of Blair. And a lot of the right-wingers in the Labour Party suggested that that would be possible as well. That things would only get better, as the new Labour leaders sang in 1997. Probably a reference most of you don't remember, I do. But the point is that the world has completely turned upside down since those times. Today the cupboard's completely bare. There's no money for these reforms. And you can really see how the Labour leaders are crushed between the hammer and the anvil, between the demands of the bankers and the imperialists on one side, and the needs of the working class on the other. And even people in the government are realizing that, they can't do anything. They've got no way forward. There was one Labour minister in Starmer's government who said, the problem is you cannot do social democracy on 1% growth. And that's the point. The whole of reformism is based on the idea that capitalism is going to get better. And in fact, it ends up being the reformists who believe in that idea more than sometimes the capitalists do themselves. And you could really see the weakness of the reformists, particularly the left reformists, with the Corbyn movement. The complete absence of any class perspective. When Corbyn came to power in 2015, the establishment attacked him vehemently, including all of the Blairite agents of the establishment, the Labour MPs inside the Parliamentary Labour Party. There was a civil war between these Blairites and the Corbyn movement, the rank and file, the workers. But the left reformist leaders, they were completely weak and they constantly capitulated at every turn. And all of that led to a huge defeat, demoralisation and disorientation of the left, which I'd say continues to this day in Britain. And as Fred said, it's left behind this huge political vacuum that the demagogues, reactionary demagogues like Farage have skillfully filled. I was chatting to some American comrades at the IEC about the DSA and what the perspectives that were there. Whether they would be able to one day successfully draw the conclusion of the need for a new party in America, a workers' party. And I said, well, if I've learned anything from seeing the reformists in Britain, don't ever underestimate the reformist leaders' ability to snatch defeat from the jaws of victory. We saw this with Corbyn last summer. He was pushed again, kicking and screaming, just like those trade union leaders over 100 years ago, pushed into creating a new party, your party. 800,000 people signed up in support in the space of a few days. And yet without a program, with lots of internal squabbling at the top, within a few weeks, it was an abortion. And he squandered that enormous potential that existed to fill that vacuum on the left. And as I said, in the world perspectives today, all of the lefts now, the trade union leaders, they're all sowing illusions in our own chameleon, careerist chameleon of Andy Burnham, who they say is the lesser evil against Farage. And even the Greens, who looked like they were going to fill that vacuum, even they are buying into this idea of popular frontism and lesser evilism. Again, because of their reformism. They don't really believe that genuine change is possible. So it's not clear what the future of the Labour Party is going to be. Whether it will go the way of PASOK and the French Socialist Party, or whether we'll see this kind of popular front alliance between Labour and the Greens and other parties, the nationalist parties in Scotland and Wales. But we're not speculating about that in Britain. We're not waiting around to see what happens. As Fred said, we're looking for those who've already gone beyond Corbynism, beyond reformism, which is a very significant layer, looking beyond reformism to revolution. This very large layer that we can win today, not tomorrow, by appealing to them on the basis of revolutionary communism. Thank you.
The next speaker will be Emil from Sweden, followed by David from Germany.
Good to go. Sweden is often presented as the great success story of reformism. Bernie Sanders even coined this phrase, Scandinavian socialism, and the Democratic Socialists of America hold it up as a model for the United States. Yet, I want to argue the exact opposite. Sweden is not mainly the success story of reformism or social democracy. It's mainly a lesson about reformism's great historical failure. Now, as Fred said, for many workers in the advanced capitalist countries, reformism really did seem to work for a period. And in Sweden and many other countries, we built the welfare states. Full employment, free healthcare, childcare for all, free education, cheap housing, decent pension and unemployment benefits. This was based on the general upswing of capitalism after the World War. And in Sweden, it went further than most due to some particular reasons. Having not participated in the World War, its industry was intact. It could export and expand to fill the needs of all of the war-torn economies. And the capitalists, wary of the proximity to the Soviet Union and the strength of the labor movement, made many reforms, often under the mere threat of class struggle. And in these conditions, the Social Democrats won the elections by promising to transform society towards socialism, but not through workers' ownership over the economy, but by managing capitalism more efficiently. By directing investment, they could keep the industry expanding and work opportunities growing. The state intervened to guarantee both profits for the bosses and reforms for the workers. But this could not go on indefinitely, and this was made clear in the crisis of the 1970s. Everything that was fueling the upswing was turned into its opposite. And now, faced with overproduction and capitalist crisis, there was no way forward. And the money for these reforms dried up. Industries closed down, productivity stagnated, unemployment and inflation came back as a scourge upon society, and the capitalists could no longer afford these friendly or peaceful relationships with the working class. Just like Thatcher and Reagan attacked the workers in the US and the UK, the Swedish bourgeoisie launched an attack on the Swedish workers in the 1980s, but they were defeated because the workers' movement was so powerful. So unable to defeat the workers head-on, the capitalists relied on the Social Democrats and the reformists to do what the market demanded. The leaders of the Social Democratic Party and the Social Democratic trade unions used their authority to carry out these attacks without causing an uproar. And the result is Sweden today. Schools, hospitals, and elderly care are in crisis now, permanent crisis. They cut off 1/4 of the public sector since the 1990s. And this was not because of the rise of some other force or political idea. The Social Democrats themselves oversaw most of the period when this process occurred. It was a consequence of their own politics and their reliance on the capitalist market. If reformism could lead to socialism, Sweden would be a socialist country. The Social Democrats had 44 years of uninterrupted rule. They got more than 51% on 2 occasions in the elections. We have 80% unionization, so massive workers' movement. They were protected by imperialism, by the Soviet Union to some extent. And all of this during the greatest historical upswing of capitalism ever, with 5% year-on-year economic growth, something we've never seen since. But instead of socialism, capitalism emerged from this stronger than ever. Instead of securing profits to later get the reforms, they now just fill the pockets of the capitalists with some distant dream of reform in the future. And to paint you a picture, last year the Financial Times published an article with a slightly ironic headline, "Sweden, a socialist paradise overflowing with billionaires." As Sweden have more billionaires in relation to the population than even the US, 50% more in fact. And not only this billionaire wealth, as a share of the economy as a whole, is the largest in the Western world, 31% and growing. And meanwhile, of course, to allow for all of this, poverty is rapidly increasing. Working conditions are harshening. There can be no confusion on the conclusions from this experience. Reformism cannot overcome capitalism. The crisis of capitalism overcame reformism completely. And this article in the Financial Times, it concluded with a warning to the ruling class of Sweden. This is a quote. "The country is generating the kind of wealth that raises the risk of an anti-capitalist revolt." And to this, we agree. And the working class of Sweden will once again rise up to fight for socialism, as they were promised by the Social Democrats before. But this time, we are building a party, the Revolutionary Communist Party, to fulfill this dream of a socialist society. Thank you.
After David, we will have Martin from Austria.
During the economic upswing, which Fred talked about, the SPD leadership accustomed themselves to their privileges, positions, and so on. And they owed their positions to the capitalists, and they knew this. Those who systematically bribed them to keep the labor movement in check. And so they rejected revolutionary upheavals, that is, they feared the organized labor movement, because their privileges and positions only exist in capitalism. And the November Revolution in Germany threatened German capitalism as never before. So, in order to defuse the situation, the ruling class used the SPD because of their influence over the workers. And the SPD betrayed the revolution. And then there was also the KPD, the Communist Party, which emerged as a left-wing split from the Social Democrats. But they were very inexperienced and therefore made a lot of mistakes. So, starting with the November Revolution, the working class had many possibilities to actually take power. But it was the leaders who weren't up for the task. And after the defeat of revolutionary 1923, German capitalism stabilized itself for a while. But all of this turned completely into its opposite with the Wall Street crash of 1929. And now the ruling class wanted the SPD to carry out heavy attacks on the working class. And the SPD refused to do that. Why? You have to imagine the reformers a bit like a knife. At first you can still cut very well with it. But the more you use it, the duller it gets. And the harder the material it's supposed to cut, that is, the deeper the political crisis that reformism is supposed to diffuse, the more rapidly it wears out. And for the SPD, diffusing the class struggle in the Weimar Republic was like cutting through a rock. It wore itself out very quickly. And if the knife isn't sharpened from time to time by the struggle to win reforms or at least some very radical speeches, it eventually gets dull. They lose their working class basis. And if that happens, the reformists become useless for the ruling class. And the SPD certainly didn't want to become useless. They wanted to keep their positions and privileges, which is why they eventually refused to carry out these attacks. So when in the beginning the SPD was a useful tool to keep the workers in check, it also came with a price. The ruling class had to make concessions to the workers, and now they should be taken away again. And out of self-preservation, the SPD refused to do that. So the ruling class needed another government, one that would heavily attack the working class. And so they installed very different repressive regimes. They installed different very repressive regimes, which they weren't fascist, but they were Bonapartist. They represented regimes of extreme crisis, because there was a stalemate between the classes. The working class tried to take power multiple times, but they failed because of the leadership. 15 minutes or 10?
You've got 10 remaining.
And the ruling class wasn't able to steer the working class back into accepting capitalism. So what happened? At first, the SPD was against these regimes and they forced re-elections. But after that, the fascists grew rapidly. And therefore, the SPD was so scared of new elections that they tolerated these repressive Bonapartist regimes. This policy of lesser evilism was the reason why these regimes could hold themselves. So even when the ruling class tried to form a government without the SPD, they still had to make use of the SPD indirectly. And these Bonapartist regimes had to balance between the classes while also repressing the working class heavily. But the limitation was that their social basis wasn't strong enough, not strong enough to crush the working class. Because this is the task of fascism, crushing the organized working class. And for this they used the petty bourgeoisie and the Lumpenproletariat, which are fascism's social basis. These are the elements that are at the bottom of society, but they are not a part of the working class, which is why they can be turned against the workers. And the ruling class tried to prevent the revolution by different means. After the revolution, they used the SPD, which was supposed to calm down their working class basis. Then they tried to use these Bonapartist regimes. And because that didn't work either, they resorted to fascism, to crush the working class once and for all. And we have to be clear about something. The victory of Hitler wasn't inevitable. The working class in Germany at this time was the strongest in the whole world. It can be argued that even after Hitler took power, if the working class had a strong leadership, they still could have turned it around. But in order to do so, the leaders would have had to mobilize the working class in order to crush the fascists and then take power. There was no other way. Of course, they also didn't want Hitler to succeed because he also threatened their position of the Social Democrats. But in order to stop Hitler, it would have been necessary to actually overthrow capitalism. And they didn't want that either, because they couldn't imagine a world without capitalism, without the privileges, without their positions and so on. So in the end, no shots were fired, there was no general strikes, no barricades were erected, nothing. The Nazis seized power without any resistance. In the so-called terror elections of 1933, the Nazis became the main political force and the KPD was banned shortly after. And the SPD was allowed to continue to exist legally for a short time, and they actually attempted to collaborate with the Nazis in order to appease them. For example, they voted in the Reichstag in favor of the Nazis' peace resolution. So much for the lesser evil. On the 1st of May 1933, Hitler proclaimed National Labor Day. And this was a move that was even supported by the trade union leaders, which were also Social Democrats. They wanted to save their own skins and therefore collaborated with Hitler, with the fascists. And if you think that's crazy, after they did it, they pathetically sold this off as a victory for the labor movement. Because they said it meant that the 1st of May would be a holiday for the entire country now. The next day, the very next day, the Nazis, the SS, stormed the trade union headquarters without encountering any resistance. On the 16th of May, so 2 weeks after, the right to strike was abolished. The trade unions were crushed. On the 23rd of June, the SPD was banned. And on the 14th of July, the Nazis were declared the sole political party in Germany. And this was only the beginning. The working class fought like lions. It was the leadership that betrayed them. The SPD leadership got accustomed to capitalism, to the privileges, and they didn't have any theory to hold against it. So they feared the working class, they feared their revolutionary aspirations. They even feared it so much that they instead tried to arrange themselves with Hitler. And I didn't have much time to talk about the KPD, the Communist Party. And the KPD was only founded during the revolution itself, during the November Revolution. And I already said that they were inexperienced and therefore made a lot of mistakes. And at some points they were also completely controlled by the Stalinists. But if the KPD would have been built long before, like we are doing right now with the RCI, they would have not only crushed Hitler. By applying the tactic of the United Front with the Social Democrats, they would have also been able to win over the rank and file Social Democratic workers, because they were also looking for a revolutionary way out. And in this case, the German Revolution, the November Revolution, would have succeeded. And this would have had enormous consequences for the whole world revolution. The historical crisis of mankind was once again reduced to the crisis of its revolutionary leadership. And to this day, this task hasn't changed. It hasn't changed a bit. So let's get to work.
Martin will be followed by Nicholas from the IS. 15 minutes, including translation.
Oh, thanks. So Fred talked about that reformism got a second or a third life after 1945. Of course, the material reason for that is the boom, but the first condition for the boom was the betrayal of the reformists. German does not have such short sentences. What Ted Grant explained as the counter-revolution in democratic form. And it's important to look back to this period to understand some aspects of reformism today. Talking about Austria, after the Second World War, the working class had the initiative. Around 6,000 factories were under workers' control. The ruling class was extremely weak. They didn't have a strong and stable state, and the economy was shattered. 68% of all corporations and banks were nationalized. It's the highest figure in all of Western Europe. So the capitalists needed the reformists to rebuild the capitalist system. They included the Communist Party for the first 3 years to rebuild the police apparatus in Vienna, include them into government. And the central role was played by the Social Democracy, who were in government for decades. They became an integrated part of the bourgeois state and even of capitalism through the state-owned industry. In even some cases, they became better managers of capitalism than the conservatives. And they were good agents of US imperialism also. In 1948, they kicked out the left opposition of the party. In 1950, they crushed the big strike movement. One union even organized thugs to beat up workers. With money and batons coming from the CIA, there were mass expulsions in the labor unions. And they increased the election period of shop stewards, for example, from 1 to 2 and then to 5 years. So that really tells you everything you get to know about bourgeois democracy. To rebuild this kind of democracy, they had to destroy everything which was left over from democracy in the labor movement. So one of the things we stress today is that the working class and the youth needs the control over their own struggle. They need to control their leaders and, if necessary, push them aside or change them, not the other way around. So after 1945, there was a long period of class collaboration. Basically, you have had dozens of institution committees of the bosses on the one side and the labor union leaders on the other side. And they decided all the important questions: prices, wages, important laws for the parliament. But as we also heard, Times have changed, and today there's no material base for reformism anymore. And there are some things we can draw out from this. Of course, this means a deep crisis of the reformist parties, social democracy being in an all-time low, as everywhere else, I guess. But it also means that left leaders are getting tested much faster, especially if they don't fight. I think there's a good example in Austria of that. In 2023, one old leftist became the head of the social democracy. He was presenting himself as a Marxist, demanding the 32-hour week. He said no to every coalition with the conservatives, as they did all the time in the past, of course. And we said that would be a progressive thing, him becoming the head of the social democracy. We said it would be a progressive thing. Just if he dared to fight. But of course he didn't. And it took him 2 or 3 weeks to capitulate fully. Now he's the head of one of the racist governments in history and explaining everyone how beautiful life will be after all the cuts. So no wonder he's one of the most hated politicians right now in Austria, because of his obvious hypocrisy. And the crisis of reformism also means a change in class relationships. After the Second World War, you had something like a long-term relationship between reformists and the bosses. Now this relationship is broken. The bosses see it more as an on-off relationship now. They want to get the social democracy in government if they can appease the working class. But if they doesn't have a role to play anymore, they kick them out. But the reformists hang on to this relationship and want to get back to the 60s and 70s all the time. And I think that's important to understand, especially when the social democracy is not in government and mobilizes. Because the reformists are not mobilizing the masses to counter the attacks of the government. They're always fighting to get a seat on the table of the bosses, to participate in the decision of the cuts. These are the concrete limits of reformism today in crisis. And depending on the circumstances and the concrete picture, we have to explain this concretely. But Austria is not only the country of social partnership, class compromise. We also have a badass history of radical class struggles. We have the January strike of 1918. The Austrian working class was the first to answer the call of the October Revolution. In July 1927, the workers in Vienna set on flame the Palace of Justice, after the bourgeois court dropped the charges against fascist murderers. In February 1934, at least we managed, instead of the Germans, to have the first armed uprising against fascists taking power. But these traditions were buried by decades of social partnership. But now with the crisis, there's the necessity to rediscover these old traditions of class struggle and revolution. And go beyond that, because the revolution and class struggles in the midterm between the war periods also failed because of the reformists. And the masses will rediscover these traditions because there's just no other way forward under capitalism. They have to fight, and our role is to help the working class and the youth to learn these lessons as fast as possible.
After Nicholas will be Daniel Morley from Britain, who will be the final speaker before I bring Fred back to reply. 15 minutes, including translation.
This afternoon I get to feel tall. This morning I felt very short because I was following Jerome. I I wanted to speak about Rosa Luxemburg and her struggles with the leadership of the Social Democratic Party. Now, Fred already mentioned that she became a household name, basically, in 1898, when she was really the first one to pick up a struggle against Bernstein. And she showed up, not just Bernstein, but also Kautsky. And this began her leadership of the left wing of German social democracy. She wasn't alone in this. There were other important figures like Mehring and Liebknecht the Younger, Karl Liebknecht. But she stands out as the most prominent out of the three of them. There was also Clara Zetkin and others. But this was what established her as a authority on the left. And as Fred explained, the social democracy in the beginning of the 20th century, they really had grown and developed a really powerful apparatus. And the membership, particularly the young membership, but also other sections, they were starting to get impatient. They were getting a few concessions here and there, but nothing fundamental out of this big machinery. And Germany, as you know, was ruled by the emperor. And although you had universal male suffrage to the Reichstag, in all the regional parliaments, they had all kinds of different rules. And there was a similar situation occurring all over Europe, where the workers didn't have access to the vote properly. So gradually the idea emerged that you should call a strike, a political strike, in order to get the suffrage. And this idea also caught hold in the left wing of the German social democracy. And they began debating it at party congresses. I can't remember, it's 1903 or 1904. But with the Russian Revolution in 1905, this whole debate gets a whole new impetus, like a whole new momentum. Because workers all over Europe could see what the Russian worker had accomplished in that revolution. And so, I can't remember if it was 1906 or 1905. The resolution was passed in favor of the general strike in order to get suffrage at the party congress. But this naturally caused outrage among the right wing of the party. And in particularly, the trade union leaders went absolutely mad. The leader of the trade union confederation, called Legion, who was always on the wrong side of every debate in the Socialist International. Any debate, at least he intervened in. He basically threatened to split the social democracy if this proposal was to move forward. And he pushed leadership to abandon this strategy in spite of a Congress decision. And it's in this context that Rosa Luxemburg writes her book, The Mass Strike, where she makes a number of exaggerations about the potential of a general strike. But you can see where she was coming from. She was trying to use the general strike as a means of breaking the impasse of German social democracy. The heavy weight of the bureaucracy was like a wet blanket over the workers' movement, and basically created a situation of status quo, where the only thing that matters was improving the size of the vote and the size of the apparatus. In 1910, there emerged a big struggle inside Prussia. Now, the German communists can correct me, but I think at that time Prussia was about 2/3 of the empire. But this massive state didn't have any kind of democracy when it came to the vote. They had a franchise to be divided up in 3 classes to ensure that the workers got the minimal amount of say. And a big movement erupted where workers were protesting all over Prussia against this. There were 100,000 workers on the streets of Berlin, for example, clashing with the police. And naturally, in this environment, Rosa Luxemburg put forward the slogan of the general strike, to get the suffrage. But by this stage, the party bureaucracy and the party leadership really had consolidated as a right-wing clique at the top. And they, although they supported the demonstration, they flatly refused to escalate the movement. Clearly, the idea was to gradually, wear out the workers through demonstration after demonstration, and then let the movement die down again. But Rosa Luxemburg was furious, and she was writing articles. She asked Karl Kautsky to publish it in the Neue Zeit, and he flatly refused, which began a polemic between Kautsky and Luxemburg about this question of the general strike for suffrage, where Kautsky accused Luxemburg of being an adventurer. And you see him here, he really reflects the attitude of the party bureaucracy. Like, if you call a general strike, obviously you're raising the, you're upping the ante, you're making a more tense confrontation with the ruling class. I don't think it was a question of an all-out general strike, but nevertheless, this would clearly provoke a big clash with the emperor, the empire, and the ruling class. And it would have threatened all these nice party offices, the somewhat friendly relations with the bosses, the newspapers they had, and all these things. And naturally, Rosa Luxemburg asked, what's the point of all these offices, all these newspapers, all these MPs, if you can't actually act when we need to do so? But this was her break with Kautsky. And she didn't have illusions in him after this point. She then continued to clash with the leadership in 1911, when she felt they didn't take a strong enough position against imperialism, German imperialism. So I got my years mixed up, that's 1912. In 1911, she clashed with them because for the first time they entered into a coalition or electoral alliance with the Liberal Party, as Fred explained. And then in 1914, she ends up in prison after having agitated for workers to refuse to fire on their French brothers. This is about 6 months before the war breaks out. And all through this period, you can see the crystallization of the left in the Social Democratic Party. But what we crucially don't see is that this left crystallizes into its own organization, with its own ideas, its own program, its own methods, and so on. Could have been used to train the cadres and prepare them for what was to come. So although Rosa Luxemburg made some mistakes in this period on the mass strike and then on the book she wrote on capital accumulation, the bigger mistake she made was actually not to ensure that this left crystallized as its own organization with its own tradition. And as the comrade explained from Germany, this meant that when the German Communist Party arises in 1918, it does so without the kind of trained cadres that the Bolsheviks had when the revolution came around in 1917. And when Rosa Luxemburg tragically was murdered in January 1919, she therefore left the party without the leadership they needed. Thanks.
That was a close one. Apologies to those of you that I couldn't bring in. Daniel will be the last speaker.
Okay. As a somewhat older comrade than a lot of you, I've lived through the crisis since 2008, the whole time as a Marxist. And it's hard not to have gone through that period without at times being astonished by the incredible ineptitude and cravenness of the reformist leaders. Here or there, you expected someone to take the opportunity to present themselves as a bit more left-wing, a bit of a fighter, but it's not really happened. And it's been so sustained in so many different countries that you have to say it's not an accident. As comrades have said, clearly the underlying reason is the crisis of capitalism. I think it's the sustained nature of that crisis. Really, you could say it goes back to the 70s. That, combined with the collapse of the Soviet Union, the drawn-out nature of that crisis, it's changed the reformist organizations and leaders. And they are really now the most responsible capitalist politicians, and they are seen as such. Whereas the openly right-wing parties, it's like they don't feel they need to apologize to the ruler, they don't need to prove themselves to the ruling class. They seem more confident to ride a bit of a populist wave sometimes. And after decades of this nothingness, I think you have to say that the working class doesn't really believe in reformism. I don't think they really believe it's possible, although they'll still vote for them when they're sick of the other party, that's true. And we live in a time in which there hasn't really been any optimism for a long time. Future will be worse than the current and the past, that's what everybody thinks. I recently, for my sins, read an academic paper on the consciousness of the working class in northern industrial towns. It wasn't that bad, actually. And they interviewed this woman called Louise, who's not even a young worker, she's 53. She said, you find yourself hoping, that things will turn around, that there'll be proper jobs, more money, and the place will come to life again. You're kind of waiting, but when you get to my age, you've been waiting for years, isn't it? Years and years. There needs to be something big. To change things, there needs to be, a revolution or something. Something big, something major. So that's why I'm all negative about everything. And, this sustained crisis, it's revealed that the system is rigged, it's revealed that bourgeois democracy is a sham, and of course social democracy depends more than any other party on the credibility of that. The other thing is, these politicians, they are the biggest liars in society. Forget about Trump, who they always say is, the biggest liar ever. Who took us to war in Iraq in Britain on the grounds of so-called weapons of mass destruction? It was Tony Blair. Is that not the biggest, most consequential political lie in the last 20 years? I would say it is. Keir Starmer won the leadership election in the Labour Party, promising to be a left-wing leader and to continue Corbyn's policies, just with a nice suit on. And he instantly just jettisoned everything. Didn't even make a play of doing anything about his programme. Is there any wonder that, people see that happening, is there any wonder that they don't believe in these politicians? Whereas the likes of Trump, obviously they lie, everyone knows that. But in the way that they speak, they kind of throw caution to the wind, and they reveal they have no time for these contrived manners. This is how little it takes for politicians to appear to be honest. This is what a low bar social democracy has set. The thing is, nobody seems to have noticed this colossal vacuum in society. This appetite for militancy, for ideas, and as this woman said, for revolution. For a drastic change, because clearly just voting in the same kind of little tinkering around stuff isn't going to do anything. Even, we have to be honest, the far left sects have basically gone the same way, to be honest. They've absorbed the same lessons, really, that the reformists have. Now, we can't write off absolutely these organizations, and we know that events shake things up. And we know we can't build a mass communist party by literally just going out and sticking posters up over and over again, year after year. But personally, I don't think we're going to see someone from these reformist organizations take up the baton and show some fight. I think they're too afraid of their own shadow, and I think they've changed too profoundly. And the tradition is gone. This is an unprecedented opportunity and responsibility for us. It seems nobody else is going to point a way forward and stand firm. And I know we can't fill that vacuum, but I do think sooner or later we are going to begin to get known as people who do that. All the more reason to study theory, study history, have a sense of proportion and sharpen ourselves up.
Thank you very much, Daniel, and to every comrade who spoke. I thought that was a very rich and very fascinating educational discussion. I'm going to give Fred 25 minutes, including translation, to reply and sum up the discussion.
Well, I'm a more principled comrade than Nicholas. I never have a problem of feeling short one day and tall the other.
Same.
I'm a consistent shortist. It makes life easier in certain ways. Anyway, just wanted to quote the guy I quoted earlier about the tragedy of social democracy. He calls it a tragedy because he thinks that the problem is they've gone too far in adopting the monetarist economic policies, the policies of the bourgeois. And they should therefore go back to being genuine reformists. Not back to the Marxist origins of the movement. Just to quote one sentence, social democracy must move beyond advocating redistributive policy and engage in a vigorous political campaign, listen to this, for the socialization of investment and democratization of the economic sphere. Now you tell me today how you achieve that without abolishing capitalism. What it reveals is the actual material base for reformism has been removed. The problem is an alternative to replace it hasn't appeared yet. I just wanted to touch on a few points. I quoted how angry Marx and Engels were at what the German leaders did with the Lassallians. You see, Marx and Engels didn't then act on their threat. Marx drew the conclusion that the mass, the base of the new party, would not have understood Marx and Engels breaking at that point. So they tried to convince the leadership, and then they worked on the party to strengthen what they saw as the Marxist wing of the party. And on the surface, that seemed to be working. The Erfurt program, on paper, seemed a much better program than the Gotha program. But unfortunately, the underlying processes that I outlined were also continuing to proceed. Another point I wanted to elaborate on is Engels, when he refers to the aristocracy of labor, which to this day sectarians use and apply it to the working classes of the advanced capitalist countries. And they write off the working class of Europe and North America. As Alan said, when Ted said, you know, they read these books but they don't understand them. Engels, after having explained that there was a layer of the working class in Britain that was benefiting from the rise of British capitalism, he refers to the fact that since the dying out of Owenism, that is the utopian socialism, he says there's been no socialism in England. By that he means no socialist movement. But he refers to the monopoly that British capitalism had. And he says, with the breakdown of that monopoly, the English working class will lose that privileged position. It will find itself generally, and he adds, the privileged and leading minority not accepted, on a level with its fellow workers abroad. And that is the reason why there will be socialism again in England. This is a Marxist looking at that phenomenon. Not the sectarian approach of some people who think they've understood Marx and Engels. Another point I wanted to clarify, I emphasized the nature of the workers' leaders of the early German social democracy. Having said that, our long-term aim is to build a proletarian party. The Bolshevik Party was a proletarian party. But the leadership and the original cadres, Lenin himself, were not proletarians. They were Marxists. They were communists. Now, we have to remember that in periods of stability, of relative class peace, the trade unions become a milieu where opportunism reigns. They're the realistic people, the pragmatic people, getting on with the daily running of the problem and managing problems, etc. Therefore, simply having a worker base itself is not a guarantee against degeneration. In actual fact, I remember this talk about the transmission belt. You know, the party is the transmission belt of revolution into the trade unions. There are times in which that transition belt goes the other way around. And it can be the transmission belt of reformism and opportunism from the trade union milieu into the party. So the only guarantee, if you're looking for a guarantee, the nearest thing you can get to a guarantee, is to stick to the basic principles of Marxism. Events will push the working class towards revolutionary conclusions. And then a worker base will be very important. The working class, such as the workers in Russia in 1917, then can become more revolutionary than even the Revolutionary Party itself. That means you've got to think dialectically and look at the contradictions in the situation and understand how things can change. One comrade sent me a question. What is a theoretician? And how do we make them? I wish I had a machine that produced them in large quantities. History shows that theoreticians actually are not that many. The key is to have them at the top, leading the party and working to raise the level of the whole party. But I think a key element is dialectical thinking. It's not by chance that Trotsky tried his best to educate the leadership of the American Trotskyists on the question of dialectics. You'd think it's a philosophical question. What importance does that have in party building? You heard Alan explaining how Lenin was reading Hegel. You could say, what does that have to do with being successful in the Russian Revolution? It has everything to do with the success of the Russian Revolution. In February 1917, without a dialectical approach, and by looking at the immediate details in front of you, you would have seen a working class that's created Soviets, but it's supporting the Mensheviks. You would see a working class with illusions in the provisional government, and you would make the mistakes that even leading figures in the Bolshevik Party were in the process of making. You know, support for the provisional government insofar as, etc., etc. You've got to have a more global picture in your head and a historical view of the process. That's why reading the history is important and understanding the contradictions at play. Because if you can see the contradictions, which are a natural condition of every process, the contradiction, you will be able to see more or less how things will develop in the future. That's the closest I can get to getting a theoretician. On the question of social democracy, I was talking to Yola in the break, and she pointed out something. This question, the social democracy has actually fused with the state, the old traditional social democracy. The Starmers of this world are men of the bourgeois. They're not naive, simple-headed reformists. They're consciously serving the interests of the ruling class. Now we have new formations appearing. In fact, what we have is a fragmentation of the political spectrum, on the left and the right. On the left, we had Syriza, which was an example. It filled the vacuum of the left by the PASOK. But then it adopted the very same policies. We have the Greens in Britain, we have Die Linke in Germany, we have the DSA in America. Many such formations One of the common threads of these organizations, if you look at the opinion polls, they have more support amongst the youth. Whereas if you look at the old social democracy, it's the older the population gets, the higher the vote is for these parties. And the reason for that is the older generation remembers the glory days of social democracy. The reformism, the genuine, what seemed to be genuine reforms. The youth don't see any of that. They've lived these parties as parties of government, parties of austerity, and that explains why the younger generation has shifted. It's also true, however, these new formations are less stable, they have no tradition, and just as quickly as they can rise, they can fall. I think a discussion on the rise and fall of these forces will not be a 150-year history. It will be a much shorter history. Now, another central element in the thinking of the reformists is the complete lack of confidence in the working class. They don't understand the role of the working class. They don't understand how the working class itself can change. The consciousness of the working class changes on the basis of events, and layer after layer draws conclusions. Therefore, the task of the revolutionary communists of Marx is to prepare for the future changes. That is why so many people out there don't understand why we're defending certain ideas. They think we're living in the past. No, we're living in the future. We can see the outlines of the future class struggle. Being a Marxist also means having the ability to resist temporary and superficial pressures from the objective situation. This is what Bernstein, Kautsky, all of them failed to do. They couldn't see the underlying contradictions. And for example, if today we were to base ourselves on the barrage of propaganda, we would not understand what's happening in Ukraine. We would draw the conclusion, for example, that the working class doesn't even exist anymore. These pressures are particularly strong in the academic world. I was talking to a young comrade, she was telling me, the pressures of postmodernism in science at university. I've spoken to students who have told me the pressures of postmodernism in music. This is a conscious attempt to combat scientific thinking. And we have to educate our cadres in the ability to resist all of these pressures. Now, the social democracy, and together with them, the trade union bureaucracy, find themselves in a very tight corner. You see, their job, if they're going to play any role, and I think the comrade who described the dilemma of the German Social Democrats before the 1933 events, the Social Democrat, their role, as Trotsky explained, is to be the labor lieutenants of the bourgeoisie in the labor movement, is to police the working class, to block the road to revolution. But in order to do that, you have to have authority with the working class. The comrades explained how they'd been used so many times prior to 33 that they became a blunt knife. We have very strong elements of that today. Starmer doesn't have the authority to hold the working class back. That's why they replaced him. Not because the guy coming in is now going to carry out reforms for the working class. It's because in the eyes of some workers, he's seen as somehow better. He's the friendly northern guy. But it's fundamentally the same. He will carry out the same policies and will end up in the same place. In fact, he can make it even worse, because the workers will say, you fooled us again. We can't trust any of you. Now, I've got to come towards the end of mine. Yes, the mass organizations. The mass organizations after the Second World War were fairly stable organisms. They started to become more unstable as the crisis of capitalism developed. And eventually, some of them were completely destabilized. Used over and over again, they lost their ability to play the role they were called on to play. And once that happens, they become like a useless rag for the bourgeois. And they will throw them in the bin when that rag has been used over and over again. But what we have to understand, and I insist on this, having understood the historical evolution of social democracy, doesn't automatically produce the solution. A revolutionary party doesn't automatically emerge from this. The conditions for the creation of such a party emerge, yes. More and more layers of the working class look for alternatives. But that alternative has got to be visible in order to be able to start to take off and become the phenomenon we want it to be. That's why that alternative has to be consciously built. It's not by chance that Lenin referred to the subjective factor. There are objective factors that produce revolution, but there is one subjective factor which is determined by the leadership. The weakness of that subjective factor in the figures such as Bebel and the others, Kautsky, produced a disaster for the working class. Now, as I said, the role of social democracy is to block the road to revolution. Its ability to do so is weakening due to the objective developments. Our task is to build a party that can remove that obstacle, which has been there for decades. And it will take flexibility in tactics. We must be able to turn rapidly as the situation changes and seek out the most advanced layers, while we remain absolutely firm in our principles. If we educate all our comrades in these ideas, then we will have learned the lessons of this 150 years of history. And the new period that opens up prepares the conditions for the final victory of this task that the Marxists gave themselves many years ago. And capitalism is facing its deepest crisis ever. It's our task to intervene in this and end the nightmare of this system. If we've learned something from all this, then we're on the road to achieving that. That's it, comrades.